It is now my pleasure to introduce the author of today's Meet the Author session. Christopher Cameron is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He was the founding president of the African American Intellectual History Society, a leading scholarly organization in the United States that's devoted to fostering dialogue about researching, writing, and teaching Black thought and culture. He completed his MA and PhD in American history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his research interests include African American religious and intellectual history, the history of slavery and the Antislavery Movement, and also American secularism. Christopher is the author of To Plead Our Own Cause, African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, published by Kent State University Press in 2014. And he is co-editor of New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, published by Northwestern University Press in 2018. Christopher is, of course, also the author of Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism, which was published last year in 2019 by Northwestern University Press and is serving as a starting point for our discussion today. So Christopher, thank you so much for being here today. And without further ado, I'll pass things over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Lauren, and for organizing this webinar today. And thanks to all of you for joining. I'm happy to be able to give you a brief overview of my book in the next 15 minutes or so, and then engage in Q&A. So I'll just start by talking about sort of how I got into the project, and then give very quick overviews of the 4 different chapters, and then hopefully we can sort of delve a bit deeper into those afterwards. So I began this project around 2012. I was finishing up revisions on my first book, To Plead Our Own Cause, which really delved deeply into sort of the interconnections of Puritan theology and Black abolitionist thought in colonial and revolutionary Massachusetts. And as I was just doing sort of the busy work of adding in citations and compiling my bibliography and stuff, I came across Al Rabbitoe's book, Slave Religion, which, I'd read back in graduate school, and I cited somewhere in To Plead Our Own Cause, and I just stopped and started reading it again. And when I got towards the end, Rabbitoe had a couple of brief paragraphs where, for most of the book, the first 300 or so pages, he's talking about the rise of sort of a syncretic form of Black Christianity. And then he has a little aside about not all slaves believing in Christianity or believing in the idea of the God. Some couldn't reconcile their lives in bondage with notions of a loving and benevolent deity. Which really struck me because that wasn't something that I ever really read about or come across in any of the historiography on slave religion or just in African American religion more broadly. And that, combined with sort of my own atheism, sort of pushed me to just start digging deeper and seeing, what exactly I could find. He lists a couple of examples of slaves who were non-believers, right, in colonial South Carolina. So I just started kind of combing through slave narratives and autobiographies and travel accounts to the South to see if this was even more of a thing than he had mentioned in his book. And I quickly found that it was, right, looking at slave narratives, looking at the accounts of evangelicals and ministers coming to the South and trying to convert slaves, you definitely find evidence for the rise of atheism in slave communities. Now, they wouldn't necessarily have called it that, right? The slaves themselves, they just didn't believe that there was a loving God looking out for them. And it was largely because of sort of the horrors and brutalities of their daily lives as enslaved people, right? The physical suffering, the emotional trauma, being separated from their families, all of these things, while they certainly pushed probably most enslaved people towards some form of religiosity, they also helped to push others towards non-belief and towards religious skepticism in the late colonial era through the antebellum period. So from there, I just started looking and trying to find examples in other areas of American history. And I knew that today, free thought and skepticism seems to be more prevalent among those with college education, among those in urban areas. So I started looking at, the Harlem Renaissance, right? I thought, well, maybe this is a period where we see a similar phenomenon as we did in the 19th century, with growing numbers of African Americans rejecting belief in God. And so when I started to do research in some of the sort of leading intellectuals and artists and activists of the 19-teens through the 1930s, I found quite a bit of evidence of religious skepticism, atheism, and agnosticism among African Americans. So among writers of the Harlem Renaissance like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, Claude McKay, Elaine Locke, James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, sort of the list goes on and on. Any major Harlem Renaissance writer that you can think about, I found most of them were religious skeptics in some way or another. Some were staunch atheists, some were agnostics, some wouldn't have called themselves either of those things, but their writings indicate that those are sort of the categories that they fit into, right? So I'm thinking of Langston Hughes here, who never really claimed for himself the title of freethinker or atheist or agnostic, but published a number of poems critical of traditional ideas of Christianity, traditional notions of God, the idea that God was looking out for Black people and cared about Black people. And then in his autobiography, discusses sort of the moment where he came to disbelieve in Jesus and disbelieve in the idea of God, which, kind of similar to a number of other freethinkers, Black freethinkers, was really the exact moment where he was supposed to be converting to Christianity, right? When he was up on the mourner's bench in a revival service in his church. And he just sort of saw behind the veil, right? Saw like the kind of manipulations that the minister and really the broader community engaged in to try to sort of bring about these conversions. And when he didn't necessarily feel this for himself in his heart, he said he stopped believing in God that day when he was like 13, 14 years old. So we see in the poetry, in the novels, in essays of Harlem Renaissance writers, this kind of a great flowering of Black free thought in the early 20th century. Susan Jacoby has referred to the period from roughly 1875 to 1915 as sort of the golden age of American free thought. Well, 1915 is when we can actually start to see the beginning of a golden age of African American free thought, where some of the leading intellectuals and political activists in Black America embraced some form of religious skepticism. So chapter 2 of the book looks at this Harlem Renaissance period and mainly focuses on writers and their written works. Chapter 3 looks at the same era, but looks more at kind of radical political activists, people who were joining the socialist and communist parties and starting to articulate various forms of Pan-Africanism or Black nationalism. So I look at the work of Hubert Harrison, for example, in trying to both sort of make socialism more appealing to African Americans. He was actually hired by a socialist party in New York City as somebody who could help bring more Blacks into the party fold. But he also saw himself as sort of a free thought prophet, right? He really kind of linked himself to Thomas Paine and to his version of free thought, because Paine, of course, wrote in a way that was kind of accessible for more of a mass audience. And Harrison saw himself as in that sort of same intellectual tradition, and thought and felt that it was sort of his role to bring free thought to the Black community, because he saw the kind of combination of Christianity and capitalism as something that was especially pernicious in the United States and throughout the world, right? Something that was used to keep Blacks in subjection here in America, and that was used to sort of enforce the color line and strengthen colonialism and imperialism in African nations and the Caribbean. So chapter 3 looks at the sort of political work of activists like Hubert Harrison, Harry Haywood, W.E.B. Du Bois, and other thinkers, Elizabeth Hendrickson, right, Louise Thompson Patterson, leading Black figures in the socialist and communist parties during the 19-teens and the 1920s, and the way that their religion either pushed them to embrace these political ideologies that were themselves critical of religion, or vice versa, right? Maybe for some of them, they came to these parties without maybe having kind of a developed critique of religion, but then soon embraced skepticism and free thought because, of course, you know, both socialists and communists were very hostile to Christianity and religion more broadly. Right, so that's what I look at in the second and third chapters, really the same era, but just taking a different approach and looking at sort of more literature and poetry and writings in one, and radical political activists in the third. And the last chapter of the book explores the civil rights era, 1960s and 1970s. And really aims to give us a more fuller picture of religion and the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement is often portrayed as primarily a religious one led by religious people. And I try to show in this chapter that while religious figures were certainly front and center in the civil rights movement, so too were freethinkers, right? People like James Forman, James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, even to a lesser extent W.B. Du Bois, although he passed away in 63. And of course, later on, as we get into the era of Black Power and the rise of the Black Panther Party, we would see many of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, like Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, David Hilliard, and others also embrace skepticism and free thought. And like the sort of generation of political activists in the Communist Party in the 1920s, many of the leaders of the Black Panther Party also embraced some form of socialism or Marxism, and articulated these sort of intersectional critiques of American society that linked together Christianity and capitalism as sort of fundamental to racism in both America and abroad. So I try to basically show that yes, while religion was certainly important to the civil rights era, we also really need to strongly consider the influence and the importance of secular activists and of secular ideologies during the civil rights movement. And we also see sort of a kind of dialectical influence of free thought on African American religion, right? Because from the 1920s up through the 1960s, free thinkers had been critiquing Black religion as otherworldly, as something that's not really suited to addressing the needs of Black people here on Earth. And I think it's no accident that in the 1966 you get the rise of Black theology with James Cone and Albert Cleage and other theologians that are seemingly taking into account these critiques of Black secular thinkers and trying to fashion a theology that is really less otherworldly and really more kind of politically engaged, I think, than maybe some of their predecessors had been in the 30 or 40 years leading up to that. This last chapter is sort of the longest one. It delves into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and some of the leaders of that. So one of the sort of top traditional civil rights organizations. I look a lot at the Black Panther Party and their sort of presentation of their own political work and political ideology as humanists, right? Huey Newton would refer to the sort of central program of the Black Panther Party, the Free Breakfast program, as a humanist endeavor, as people sort of taking responsibility for their own communities, engaging in self-determination and doing for themselves, right? And we also see the Black Panther newspaper, the organ of the Black Panther Party, as an outlet for secular thought during this period, whether it's from, essays by Huey Newton, or whether it's poetry by writers like Yvette Pearson and Sarah Webster Fabio. We see this newspaper serving as something of a free thought publication. Its main purpose, of course, was political, but it also helped to sort of spread secular thought among readers of that paper. And then a brief afterward kind of traces the course of free thought after 1975 and looking at the kind of institutionalization of Black free thought with the creation of groups like African Americans for Humanism in 1989 and Black Nonbelievers Incorporated more recently in 2011. I argue that these are sort of this is sort of the central theme in Black free thought and one of the most important things driving Black secularism after the 1980s. And that's basically going to be the subject of another volume on Black free thought. So chapter 4 ends right around 1975 when we see the Black Panther Party in decline. And then volume 2 will sort of take the story from 1975 to 2020 and explore sort of the institutionalization of Black free thought, as well as the increasing prominence of African-American secularism and free thought in Black popular culture and hip hop music and film, as well as continuing to look at literature, poetry, stuff like that. So I'll end there. I think that's right about 15 minutes, and looking forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a wonderful overview. So yeah, we'll move into the Q&A session. So if you have a question you'd like to ask or a comment you'd like to make, you can just message the group chat and let me know that you would like your microphone to be unmuted. Alternatively, you can type out your question or comment and I can also read it out loud for you. And we'll first go to Ryan.
Hi, Christopher. Thanks for the summary and for the book. I hate to admit it, but I'm halfway done. So here's my copy, right? So I haven't read the whole thing, but so far, really fascinating. I appreciate the history. I think it's sorely needed. So I really do appreciate that. I have several questions, but I'm just going to ask one to start with, and then we'll let others. My first one. Obviously, like I said, I've only read half the book, but the first chapter that really kind of talks about the slave period, and if you hear a voice in the background, I'm sharing an office with my wife, so I apologize, but the slave narrative kind of piece and free thought and atheism during that time period, I'm wondering if you can speak to the fact that it didn't seem like there were a lot of actual slave narratives in there. There were more, it almost struck me as like there were people who said lots of slaves were non-believers, but there weren't a lot of slaves who said I was not a believer, right? And so I'm kind of surprised by that. I've read the book that you mentioned earlier, right? That kind of inspired you to think about this, and I saw the same thing. And so I've wondered for a very long time, like, were there non-believing slaves, right? Like, what was the situation there? And I was really hoping that you were going to just have like narrative after narrative after narrative of like, none of them believed, and here's the evidence. And I didn't see it. And I was like, is it not there? And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to that. Like, is it there? Is it not there? What's the situation? So that's my first question.
Yeah. So for the earlier period, I basically had to pull together a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence, as you point out. But I think when you sort of taken together, it does provide evidence that there's something going on. So of the slave narrators, the only two that I actually found who discussed their own non-belief were William Wells Brown and Frederick Douglass. But for most others, as you point out, they note that other slaves didn't believe. And this is really because of, I think, the function that these narratives were supposed to serve in bringing attention to the harmful effects of slavery, right? And making the argument that, look, slavery is basically degrading and hurting the cause of Christianity in the South. It was something that I think was meant to sort of build allies, especially among evangelical and highly religious Christian activists. So even if some of these slave narrators were non-believers, it really wouldn't have behooved them to actually admit that. I think that would have hurt their cause. It helps them to say that slavery is fostering atheism. It really would have hurt them to say that because of slavery, I became an atheist and I'm still an atheist, right? Now, Frederick Douglass says, yes, I did become an atheist, and then I moved into something else. And then later autobiographies, he sort of changes tunes a little bit. But I think it's really because of the functions that they were supposed to serve. But for me, looking at sort of the number of times that that it's mentioned that that the presence of atheism in the slave community is mentioned at least in, I think, probably 7 or 8 different narratives that I came across. As well as sort of combining that with both Black and white travelers to the South, tells me that this is a thing that's going on. But unfortunately, aside from William Wells Brown and Douglass, there are very few actual, like, hey, this guy is an atheist and he says he became one because of this. So yeah, that is definitely kind of a drawback of the argument in that first chapter, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. And is there another question or comment anyone would like to make right now? Ryan has 2 more, but he can wait. So would anyone like to go right now before Ryan? I think I see Lori raising a hand.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you so much. I wanted to just, and this is just because I'm in the process of exploring meanings of terms. And so I just am interested in how you're reflecting on the terminology that you're using, especially the notion of the secular. This is a bit more theoretical question. The notion of the secular, also free thinker. You sort of use those a little bit interchangeably. And I'm just curious about how you're thinking about the secular and what that means for you. And again, I'm struggling with this too. In fact, I've banished the word secular from my own work for a bit just to see what happens. I'm not going to report to you on how that experiment is going, but I am curious about how you're thinking about these terms and how you grapple with them.
Yeah, in my talks, I use secular a lot more than I do in the book itself. I mainly refer to these people as free thinkers. Really, the way I'm thinking of that is, atheists and agnostics certainly counts, but generally people who are strongly opposed to the kind of traditional religious ideas of their day, right? So of course, free thought is kind of relative to what is kind of orthodox and what is most widespread at, that particular time. So I think, for example, Douglass at various times, he articulates kind of agnostic positions, deist positions. But reading Douglass today, I think a lot of readers and especially a lot of Black atheists today would probably consider him pretty religious, right? Because of the kind of God talk that he employs. Although for his time, he was certainly kind of lambasted, I think, as a free thinker and as an infidel. So yeah, for the most part, I think for a free thinker, I'm just thinking of atheist, agnostic, or people that are kind of generally opposed to the traditional religions of their time. But I think they don't necessarily have to be atheists, right? So deists, believe in God, right? But they believe in a God that really has no effect on human life. So I think they would certainly count Zora Neale Hurston is kind of in that same vein, I think, of kind of skirting the lines between agnosticism and deism. So in this book, I think I'm probably pretty influenced by Susan Jacoby's definition of free thought and viewing it as relative to the time period, and in sort of making some space for people who have a conception of God and have a belief in God, but it's very sort of different from what is kind of mainstream or orthodox during their time.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Lori, too, for that question. Is there anyone else right now who wants to ask a question before we go back to Ryan? All right, and Ryan, I'll go back to you.
All right, I'm up again. Thanks. So this next question, I don't mean for it to be like politically incorrect. So if it is, like, call me out, right? But I don't think it is. I'm just wondering about this question. Again, I've only read half the book, so maybe you answer this towards the end, and I haven't gotten there. But I'm wondering how influential white freethinkers are on Black freethinkers. The narrative that I'm getting so far in the book seems like previous generations of Black freethinkers are influencing next generations of Black freethinkers, right? And I think that's a great narrative. I think that's absolutely accurate and reflective of what's going on. But at the same time, we have kind of this group and wave of Black freethinkers and the Harlem Renaissance and all of these people. They're also obviously reading other stuff by white writers, right? And you mentioned Nietzsche at times, you mentioned Feuerbach, you mentioned a number of other philosophers, but I'm wondering, like, do you have any sense of how influential other people are who are not part of the specific kind of Black free thought movement on the thinking of these individuals? I just was wondering if that comes out in the stuff that you've read as well.
Yeah, certainly. So in the 19th century, not very influential because atheism really among Blacks really emerged on a kind of very alternative path than it did among whites. So, and that's just, of course, because of the kind of access that slaves had, right? We don't see atheism or agnosticism particularly widespread among free Blacks in the North. I'm sure there were some, but I haven't really found a lot, aside from the kind of brief flirtation of that Northern minister with atheism that I discussed as the opening vignette to chapter 1. Nathaniel Paul, but for slaves, it's really kind of a homegrown type of atheism that really emerges from their lived reality. So we really don't see, Fanny Wright or Robert Owen or Thomas Paine or any of those people playing any type of role in free thought among Blacks during the 19th century. But in the 20th century, so Many Black atheists and agnostics then would have read Frederick Douglass, would have been influenced by him, but many also by that time were either highly self-educated, like Hubert Harrison, of course, who was reading Thomas Paine, or who were, more traditionally educated, like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston attending Columbia, W.B. Du Bois, of course, at Harvard. And so they were reading, they were reading Paine, and they were reading European philosophers. And so they were much more, I think, conversant with both European and American skepticism, thinkers from 1915 onward. Of course, by the time we get to the civil rights movement, you have a very creative blend of both of those traditions, right? And I think that's epitomized pretty well in Stokely Carmichael, who I open chapter 4 with. So Carmichael talks about how he used to go down to, he grew up in the Bronx, but he lived in a largely Jewish neighborhood, so he couldn't find a good barber there. So he used to travel down to Harlem to get his hair cut. And while there, he would encounter a lot of like stepladder orators, basically sort of the new Hubert Harrisons and whatnot. And some of these were sort of older political activists who had been around since the 1920s and 1930s, right? So some folks that I discuss in chapter 3, some of these leading Black communist freethinkers were still around Harlem, hanging around the barber shops, working, doing their thing, still organizing, still giving talks. So we see people like Carmichael being influenced by this sort of older generation of Black freethinkers, but he's also a student at Bronx High School of Science. So he's getting a very strong scientific and philosophical education. So he's really sort of in kind of being influenced by both of these traditions of Black and white free thought. And that becomes increasingly common by the time we get to the 1960s.
Cool, thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Sure.
Yeah, that was just something that was in the back of my head as I was reading this, that certainly for the, like you said, in the 19th century, it seemed like there was very little influence, right? And then it seems to be coming in later. So that makes a lot of sense. Appreciate that.
Yeah. And as you probably saw by the point you are at the book, I discuss some white freethinkers' views on race in chapter 1. But really, I self-consciously tried to keep the focus overwhelmingly on the Black thinkers, just because, I think there's obviously a lot more work that needs to be done on just secularism in general, but we really haven't had this sort of overarching history of Black free thought. So I really wanted to center them, but, a bigger book could have sort of done a little more to look at some of those interactions.
Awesome, thank you. We now have another question. Guilherme.
Sorry. So first of all, congratulations for your work. It will be very good if someone does a similar study here in Brazil. I came in a little late, so if this topic has already been raised, I apologize for bringing it up again. Still under the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, do you see any relationship between this movement and the African American secularism?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think we see some relationships. So a part of this movement, and I have a new edited collection coming out called Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter. So two of the chapters go into this a little bit. One is my chapter looking at this new group called Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. And this is sort of a movement within the Unitarian Universalist Association to sort of meld the theology of Unitarian Universalism with the political principles of Black Lives Matter. And of course, a number of members of Blue, as it's called, consider themselves atheists or agnostic. So that's sort of a kind of growing religious movement, but one that includes a lot of non-religious people. But yeah, I mean, we certainly see sort of kind of generational, theological, political divides, I think, in Black Lives Matter. You see the sort of prominence really from the start of the movement of LGBTQ identified people, many of whom sort of face discrimination in kind of traditional mainline Black churches. And so not all of them are pushed or embrace atheism or agnosticism. Some are increasingly turning to African religious traditions, Ifa, Yoruba traditions, things like that. But many certainly are kind of embracing secularism today. So yeah, I think it is a big part of Black Lives Matter. Okay.
Awesome, thank you for that question. Is there another question or comment right now?
You want to go back to me?
You know what? I'll give you a break, Ryan. I'll ask mine right now.
Awesome.
We'll go back to yours. So again, thinking of Black Lives Matter too, something I saw kind of taking a stronghold on social media too is intersectional feminism. And something too that surprised me about this book, or I should say I wasn't expecting, was the role that Black women freethinkers played, and also the critiques they have of sexism and also Christianity. I'm wondering, when you started research for this book too, is that something you were kind of expecting to find, or were you also a little bit surprised to see not just that it's there, but the strong role that it did play?
Yeah, I can't say I was necessarily expecting to find it, but I was very hopeful that I would. And one of the sort of very influential books early on for me in sort of really getting me started on this project was Sakivu Hutchinson's book, Moral Combat, where she sort of looks at the sort of critiques of patriarchy and sexism prevalent among some Black women freethinkers, but also the reasons why Black women are sort of less likely to embrace free thought, why sort of the kind of prevalence of respectability politics and how it's sort of it's not really acceptable for Black people to be free thinkers, but for those who it is, it's sort of more acceptable among men, right? And Black women are seen as the kind of keepers of religious traditions, and she argues that they're seen as particularly sort of vile if they sort of reject religious traditions, right? Whereas men, it's a little more acceptable, and of course that's because of patriarchy and sexism. So I was, reading her book, I was hoping to find, the strong influence of Black women freethinkers. And while their numbers have not been as large as those of men, I was able to find that they had very much an outsized influence in this movement, right? So the first kind of major free thought novel was Nella Larson's Quicksand, right? We see, of course, secular themes in, essays by Hubert Harrison and speeches and poetry of Langston Hughes, and of course, the slave narratives before. But if we're looking at a novel, Nella Larson kicks it off, and she really helps to sort of advance kind of an intersectional critique of gender, religion, and class in this novel, something that would become a staple of Black feminist thought 50 years before we even had something called Black feminism, right? So we see that, at various moments, people like her, Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Walker, Lorraine Hansberry have made very important contributions to sort of Black secular thought, as well as Black intellectual history more broadly, right? So Lorraine Hansberry, she didn't necessarily publish articles or essays or anything like that was hostile to religion, but she sort of embedded it in Raisin in the Sun, her most famous work, and something that was read by thousands and thousands of people, right? So probably many more people would have been exposed to this than, if she had published it in the Truth Seeker or something like that. Not to sort of denigrate that publication, but so yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to find the kind of significance and the connections among Black women freethinkers, right? Alice Walker kind of helping to basically rediscover Zora Neale Hurston's work, and to help get her work kind of republished. And of course, Zora Neale Hurston's work, is still read today, and it's something that's still sort of influencing people. So yeah, that was something that wasn't necessarily expected, but was sort of a pleasant surprise. And of course, in the contemporary period, Black women freethinkers really are kind of leading this movement among African Americans, especially with Ayanna Watson founded Black Atheists of America back in 2011. That organization is now defunct, but it was, going strong for a good 6 or 7 years, had a vibrant web presence and social media presence. Was actually pretty useful for me when I was starting out this research, because on their website, her website, she had just a number of kind of short blog posts on individual Black freethinkers that sort of identified some of these people for me. And then of course I could kind of return to their original works. And then Mandisa Thomas and founding Black Nonbelievers in 2011. That organization is growing strong and is the largest, most vibrant Black secular organization in the country. I think it has 15 or 16 different chapters across the country, hosts, webinars now, but when we were doing things in person, had conferences like Black Woman of Color, Woman of Color Beyond Belief. They were going to host their third one this year, but that's been postponed till next year. So they're doing wonderful work. So we can see really Black women freethinkers kind of leading this movement today.
Great, thank you so much for that answer.
Sure.
Yeah, again, I sometimes too encounter this narrative that women are often more religious. And learning about the history of atheism, non-religion, it's often these male philosophers and thinkers. So it's really wonderful to see in the book. And yeah, so is there another question or comment right now?
Looks like Jordan has one.
Awesome, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I need to apologize for showing up late. I really thought this started at 11:30. I don't know why.
No problem.
So the question might have been asked before, but this is sort of going off of Lauren, where we're talking about Black women writers and thinkers of the 20th century, working through plays and different sort of creative genres. But in your afterword, you started going into Octavia Butler's work in science fiction in particular. And I thought it was really interesting because based on your description, you described that like Octavia or Butler is working in a realm or in a universe where God and that type of theistic thought is non-existent. It's not even imaginable.
Yeah.
So it opens up this really interesting sort of universe to think with. And I was wondering if you could describe that genre a little bit more as it relates to Black free thought, science fiction in particular.
Yeah. In the afterword, I was really hinting at sort of topics that I would delve much more deeply into in the second volume. So I've read probably 3 or 4 of Butler's novels, and that's just something that really struck me, is that, God does not play a significant or really any role in her books. And then I started reading just some of, some interviews and essays that she had written some nonfiction essays and found that she herself was an atheist. So she has a whole trove of papers at the Huntington Library that I just applied for a grant for. So I might even have a whole chapter on her in volume 2. She's probably the only science fiction writer that I've really read in terms of looking at their sort of secular perspectives. So I really just need to kind of dig more into that. But I will say that, I don't think it's an accident that that these secular themes, or even just a lack of discussion of God, kind of comes up again and again in Black fiction, right? Because this is an area, and even poetry too, because this is an area where, Black women especially have the kind of plausible deniability that they might not have if they just wrote an outright sort of essay critical of religion, right? Nella Larson could say in Quicksand, well, I was writing about Helga Crane. Those are Helga's beliefs, when everybody knew Helga Crane was her, right? And, the same thing with Zora Neale Hurston or Lorraine Hansberry, although Hansberry kind of comes out and says that Beneatha in her play was actually her 8 years ago. But, these genres are ways where you can sort of creatively explore ideas that are dangerous, especially for Black women to explore in sort of other formats. So I found it really fascinating kind of delving into Black literature. I really relied on the work of literary scholars like Nellie McKay and Thaddeus Davis and others, especially interpreting some of the kind of feminist themes in their work, and then kind of linking that to their secular perspective. But something I need to do a lot more work in, and hopefully if we get a vaccine out soon, I'll be in the Huntington next summer, digging into Butler quite a bit more.
Thank you. Yeah, and it wasn't even just Butler as well, but going off of Baldwin, I think there was one other author that you mentioned who, I can't remember, but he was a bisexual writer in the 20s and 30s. So there's this avenue of Black queer literary works as well that sort of allow them to talk about these things, these personal things, without going into sort of personal essays.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thank you, Jordan, for that question. That was awesome. Any other question or comment? Seeing if there's any hands raised right now. All right, Ryan, I think you're up if you want to ask your third question. And again, anyone, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can type it in the chat box, and I can ask it aloud for you too.
Okay, and I've got another one pending too that's just like occurring to me as we're talking about this. But so I made an argument in one of my publications at one point that for many people who leave religion, become non-believers or free thinkers, it's often tied to the way in which they think religion oppressed them, right? So for example, lesbian and gay individuals, they often will reference the fact that religion was oppressive of their sexuality, and that's why they left. And so I noticed a lot in, again, I've only read the first half of the book. A lot of the arguments against the existence of God are tied to theodicy or the problem of evil, right? Do you think that is tied to this kind of argument that I'm making, that the reason why these people are non-believers, why they don't, why religion is problematic for them, is because they see how oppressive it is, in the sense that they are being oppressed, right? And God is not helping them. God is not stepping in and solving these problems or aiding them in any way. Do you think there's a connection there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So theodicy, the problem of evil, really is kind of the, I think, central thing pushing African Americans toward free thought, not only in the era of slavery, but really throughout the 20th century as well. And most of the arguments that you see against Christianity as a religious system and against the idea of God are that, you know, both of these ideas and Christianity has been sort of used as a weapon against Black people. It's being used right now in the 20th century to enforce the color line. It's been used previously to justify the institution of slavery. Anything that can be used for sort of such nefarious purposes can't be good or can't be true, right? So yeah, I do think that's sort of the kind of central reason that Black people come to reject the idea of God. But it's certainly not the only reason, and especially, you know, in the last 30 years or so, I think atheism is much more prevalent among, you know, Black scientists and people just with sort of higher education, and you're starting to see a lot more kind of arguments against God just from the idea not being a reasonable one rather than it being sort of a harmful one towards Black people.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, and okay, and we still have a few more minutes if anyone else would like to ask a question. Ryan has one more. Does anyone else have one more? I'm just going to check quickly. All right, and Ryan, take it away.
All right. Maybe Christopher and I just need to go get drinks or something and just have a chat like that. That's what we should do. Maybe Lori will pay for us to go get lunch and I can ask him all my questions. Strangely, there's a little bit of background here. When the pandemic hit and we all went on lockdown, right? I usually exercise in other ways, but I started riding my bike and I was riding in the park. And of course, I try and multitask like any good academic. So I was listening to books while I was riding my bike. And I happened to get an audio version of a book called Gods of the Upper Air. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a historical treatment of the kind of circle of anthropologists around Franz Boas at Columbia. And Zora Neale Hurston was one of those, right? And the book was fascinating. It was really, really informative and interesting. But one of the things when you talked about Zora Neale Hurston in the book that I just kind of, I didn't see a lot of discussion of her anthropological training. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how you think that might have influenced the way that she was seeing the world at the time, and maybe if that influenced her free thought?
Yeah, I definitely think it did. So she got her bachelor's and master's degree at Columbia working with Boas. I briefly mentioned him because he published an article critical of Christianity in the Crisis magazine. I mentioned him in chapter 3 when I'm talking about W.B. Du Bois, because Du Bois was sort of criticized for allowing such an article to be published in the Crisis. But yeah, I mean, Hurston worked with him at Columbia University, I think was probably very much influenced by him, as well as other philosophers and thinkers that she was reading there. And we do see some of her secular thought coming out most strongly in her anthropological work, especially her work Mules and Men. So I have a separate article in the Journal of Africana Religions that focuses just on Zora Neale Hurston. And it's called Zora Neale Hurston, Free Thought in African American Religion. And in Mules and Men and in some of her other anthropological writings, she sort of explores religious practices and the way that religion kind of helps to build communal identities. And we see here this sort of interesting blend of religion and free thought in her own life and probably in the lives of a lot of other Black freethinkers, in that she was initiated into voodoo in New Orleans, right? But she writes in Mules and Men that she didn't necessarily believe in the kind of supernatural elements of it, but she thought it was really useful and good for kind of building community and for establishing a particular identity. And so while she was personally a religious skeptic and didn't necessarily believe in supernatural forces, she nevertheless kind of participated in these in this religious tradition. And, you know, the same is true of other Black freethinkers, like, you know, A. Philip Randolph being a member of an AME church from the mid-1920s up through the 1970s, yet, you know, publishing essays in the Messenger magazine that are highly critical of Christianity, and towards the end of his life being awarded the Humanist of the Year award from the American Humanist Association. Well, Cynthia Taylor, in a book on A. Philip Randolph's sort of religious belief, takes his membership in this church as indicative of what he actually believes. And I say it's really more just a pragmatic way for him to build connections within the Black community. So I'm sort of diverging a little bit, but yeah, basically for Hurston and I think other freethinkers, participating in religious rituals and participating in particular churches was a way of kind of keeping connections within the Black community, was a way of, you know, for somebody like Randolph advancing a particular political and economic agenda, but isn't necessarily indicative of a sort of embrace of those beliefs.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Ryan, again for that question. It's great. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'll just conclude briefly then by thanking all of our participants for being here for this Meet the Author session. And Christopher, thank you so very much for taking the time to be here and talk to us about your book and your research. It was really great, so yeah, thank you again. And on that note, I'll just say, yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. I enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher.